The first time the millionaire noticed the garbage man, it was because his daughter had stopped breathing for 3 seconds. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, in front of a mansion that looked perfect from the outside but was slowly breaking apart inside. Richard Thompson stood frozen at the tall glass window, his phone clenched in his hand, panic rushing through his veins as his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, stared blankly at the world again, silent, distant, unreachable. Then a rough, warm voice floated up from the driveway below, humming an old hymn Richard hadn't heard since his own childhood. Emily's chest rose again, her eyes shifted, and for the first time in days she didn't look completely lost. Richard didn't know it yet, but that moment would change all of their lives. Emily Thompson had been silent since birth. Doctors called it a rare neurological condition. Specialists used complicated words, expensive machines, and even more expensive promises. Richard paid for all of it. He was a self-made millionaire, the kind magazines loved to praise, steel-jawed, sharp-minded, always in control. But none of his money could buy his daughter a voice. Emily didn't cry as a baby. She didn't babble. She didn't scream in tantrums like other children. She communicated with her eyes and small, careful gestures. Richard learned to read those signs like a second language, but every night when the mansion fell quiet, the silence felt heavier than any sound ever could. After his wife, Margaret, passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, that silence became unbearable. It was just Richard and Emily now, him drowning in meetings and grief, her locked inside a world no one could reach. That's when Daniel Carter entered their lives. Daniel was a garbage man. Every morning at exactly 6:10 a.m., his truck rolled through the Thompson neighborhood. He was a single father too, raising his 5-year-old son, Noah, after his wife died in a car accident. Daniel wore old boots, faded gloves, and a smile that didn't look forced. He talked to people who usually looked right through him. He waved at dogs, joked with security guards, and sang softly while he worked. And every morning, Emily watched him. It started subtly. Richard noticed her standing closer to the window, her fingers pressed against the glass. When Daniel's truck appeared, Emily's eyes followed it with focus Richard rarely saw. Sometimes she tilted her head when Daniel sang. Sometimes her fingers moved like she was trying to catch the melody. Richard told himself it was nothing. He'd been disappointed too many times before. One morning, Daniel noticed the little girl at the window. He waved instinctively. To his surprise, Emily lifted her hand, slow, uncertain, but she waved back. Daniel smiled wider and tipped his cap. From then on, it became a ritual. Daniel waved. Emily watched. Sometimes Daniel sang louder, not for attention, but because the hymn felt right in the morning air. He didn't know why the child behind the glass mattered to him, only that something about her quiet presence felt familiar. One day, the unthinkable happened. As Daniel lifted a heavy bin, he heard a sharp crash from the mansion. A maid screamed. Daniel dropped everything and ran toward the gate without thinking. Security hesitated for half a second, but when they saw Emily collapsed on the marble floor inside, her small body trembling, they opened the gate. Richard was kneeling beside her, his face pale, calling her name over and over. "I know CPR," Daniel said, already on his knees. "I've got a kid, please." Richard didn't hesitate, he nodded. Daniel worked carefully, speaking softly, calmly, like he did with his son during nightmares. "You're okay, sweetheart, you're safe. Just breathe with me." Emily gasped. Relief flooded the room. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but the crisis had passed. Richard stood shaking, staring at Daniel like he'd just seen a ghost. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You saved my daughter." Daniel shrugged awkwardly. Any parent would have done the same. That should have been the end of it. But Richard couldn't forget how Emily had reacted, not with fear but with calm, with trust. A week later, Richard did something he never thought he would do. He invited Daniel inside. Daniel was uncomfortable in the mansion. His clothes felt out of place. His hands were rough, but Emily sat on the couch, watching him closely, her eyes bright. Daniel spoke to her like she could answer. He told her about Noah, about the silly faces he made, about the old guitar Daniel played at night. He hummed the same hymn he sang on the truck. Emily leaned forward. Her fingers trembled, her lips parted. Nothing came out, but it was the closest she'd ever come. Richard's heart pounded. Days turned into weeks. Richard hired Daniel part-time, not as help but as company. He justified it as routine stability. But the truth was simpler. Emily responded to Daniel in ways no therapist ever had. There were setbacks. Emily had days where she withdrew completely. Richard doubted himself. Daniel nearly quit, afraid he was giving false hope. "I'm just a garbage man," Daniel said one night. "I don't want to hurt her." "You're a father," Richard replied, "and right now that matters more than anything." The real challenge came when specialists warned Richard that emotional attachment without clinical progress could be dangerous. They pushed new treatments, new costs, new risks. Richard stood at a crossroads, between science that hadn't worked and a simple human connection that somehow was. He chose the connection. One rainy afternoon, Daniel brought his old guitar. He played softly, singing about grace, about broken things made whole. Emily sat across from him, hands clenched in her lap. Then it happened. A sound. Not a word, not even a clear syllable. But a voice. A small, trembling duh. The room froze. Richard dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Daniel stopped playing, his hands shaking. Emily looked confused, then scared, like she hadn't meant to do it. Daniel smiled gently. "It's okay," he whispered. "You did great." That single sound changed everything. Speech therapy followed. Progress was slow, uneven, painful at times. Emily cried more than she ever had before, but now the silence was breaking. Months later, on a bright Sunday morning, Richard sat in the front row of a small church, one he hadn't entered in decades. Daniel stood beside him. Emily clutched Richard's hand. The choir sang the same hymn Daniel once hummed on a garbage route. And Emily sang with them. Her voice was soft, imperfect, but real. Richard finally understood what money never taught him, that miracles don't always come from power or privilege. Sometimes they arrive in worn boots, with calloused hands and a heart big enough to see a silent child as worth singing for. Daniel never stopped being a garbage man. Richard never stopped being a father learning humility. And Emily, she found her voice, not because the world demanded it, but because someone believed she already had one. And that belief changed everything.